In a world full of threats where the stakes are high, you can crash and burn or you can learn to fly. From cyber hacks to the supply chain snap, one wrong move and you're caught in a trap. But every Monday morning when the storm rolls in, there's a beacon of truth through the static and spin. Two voices break through with a confident tone, Jimmy and Nick on the microphone. It's risky business, but we play it smart, mapping out the danger like a work of art. From zero-day threats to the human glitch, we don't flinch, we pivot, we flip that switch. Tune in and you'll see we don't panic, we plan. On the Risky Business Podcast, we make our stand. Break down breaches and boardroom fails, talk whistleblowers and fishing tales. ISO sight to all that jazz, with Jimmy's grit and Nick's pizzazz. Every risk's a story, every threat's a clue. From compliance woes to a ransomware coup, they've seen it all and they're here to teach how to surf that wave, not get dragged off the beach. It's risky business, but we play it cool, like pros with a plan and a golden rule. Assess, respond, and mitigate fast. No shortcuts, no free pass. If you want to survive, you better tune in quick. Jimmy and Nick got the risky business fix. Ain't a monster hiding under your bed. It's a puzzle to solve a few steps ahead. With the framework tight and your culture strong, you'll be singing this chorus all year long. You'll be lucky, log in, and a plan B that's better than plan A. It's just good risk hygiene. Find a risky business, but we're built to last. Forecasting the future, walk a learning from the past. From breach to boardroom, we don't blink. We risk it all, but never think. So pour your coffee, let that playlist tip. It's time for Risky Business with Jimmy and Nick.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first episode of Risky Business. We are excited to get this launched. With me is my co-host, Jimmy. Jimmy, what's up, man?
Hey, Nick, what's going on, man?
So the two of us decided to go ahead and put out a podcast, related to risk and physical security and everything in between, coming from our two backgrounds, two professional backgrounds. So because it's our first episode, we want to introduce ourselves and kind of tell you where we're coming from and what kind of experience we bring to these conversations. So I'll kick it off to Jimmy with intros.
Sure. So Jimmy Alfs and Nick, first off, thanks for really driving this and looking forward to the discussion. I think overall, I think the goal here is to make this an exciting topic. You and I have a pretty a lot of experience and very passionate about the risk and physical security support. So I'm looking forward to this. As far as my background, I'm going to start way, in the back and maybe go a little bit long-winded with it, just so we understand kind of where I'm coming from and where my passion for security risk comes from. So way back in the day, graduated and I joined, through ROTC, and I was an Air Force officer in security forces. Primarily security forces, military police. We do a lot of military police support, but really early on, I started getting into the risk management and risk identification phase. My first risk assessment I ever did was actually for General Mattis in Kuwait in 2002 when we were building up for the Iraq invasion. The Marine Corps didn't have as much of a robust security management presence. So myself and one of my colleagues went to the Marine Corps base and conducted the first, basically a vulnerability assessment. And I know we'll talk extensively about the difference between a risk assessment and vulnerability assessment, but really looking to see where there were some concerns for General Mattis's camp. Um, Over time, developed various other processes. I ended up running the United States Central Command's risk assessment team out of MacDill Air Force Base, where really starting to hone the magic and the mathematics behind the risk and where we're getting to it and understanding the processes of risk and why it's important to our senior leaders and why it's important that we're able to speak to it. From there, moved on to U.S. Special Operations Command Central, where I ran the security risk management team for them as well. Really working with our special operators to go look at the locations that they're operating from and making sure that they protected themselves and had everything they needed to secure their locations, their camps before they went and did what special operations guys do best. From there, went over to I joined Amazon for a few years. I was on the physical security team for about half of that time, and then the last half, and this is really where Nick and I got to know each other. Helped run the security risk management team, where hundreds of risk assessments, hundreds of vulnerability reviews, and I think up until that point, up until the point I joined Amazon, there wasn't a whole lot of rigor. There wasn't a whole lot of processes in place. At least as far as I was concerned, when it came to risk, I really learned the need to develop and be very specific with my risk methodology and the risk background and how we do the scoring. A lot of what we're going to talk about here. From Amazon, I'm now with filling a new corporate role. Managing office security for one of the big four consulting firms, and again, taking what I've developed, what I honed at Amazon, and applying it to the office security space. Looking at the threats, looking at the vulnerabilities, and developing risks so that we can better speak to those risks to our business leaders. So long history, and I probably went a little bit even more long-winded than I was expected. But over 25 years of doing this, and have a huge passion and really excited to break this down and provide some clarity about what risk is, why it matters, and why, as a security practitioner, we need to know how to speak to this risk. So that's me, Nick. What do you got?
Yeah, so for me, and I'll tell how our lives kind of weave together. I started on the other side of the military, being in law enforcement, starting up in New York City. And prior to doing that, I was in retail. I was in retail loss prevention. Started running after shoplifters, and then made my way up through Home Depot and Lowe's, and the calling for law enforcement came, and I went. I served in New York City, and then I moved down to the Washington, D.C. area. Had a career, a very great career there, became a commander there, was a great career. And it was time for me to move on. I couldn't run after people and jump over fences anymore. So, I
happens to the best of us, man. Happens to the best of us.
Yeah, it's that first time you make it halfway up the fence and you're like, this isn't for me anymore. So,
right.
I applied for Amazon, and I was hired as a regional loss prevention manager in Amazon, and I covered about 118 sites, which doesn't seem like it's a lot, but it really is. And I didn't have very much risk background. I met Jimmy during that role. I remember him coming to my office and talking to me about risk, and it went in and went out because I didn't really truly understand. I didn't understand the importance of it. I didn't understand that I was working harder instead of smarter, and I wasn't letting risk assessments help me in my role. And it's only until I got the call to come on over to your team in Amazon where I really started to understand what risk was, because I knew nothing. I knew nothing about risk assessments. I knew nothing about any of that stuff other than the typical, reports that you do or assessments.
Yep.
Those are typical, and I think everybody can agree. Mostly those are done for compliance rather than doing it for the proper reasons. And risk is a different beast. I think the other part, and you kind of touched on it, is I think there are, like, I think folks have a tough time understanding what the methodology is. And instead of understanding what that methodology is, they try and reinvent that methodology, or they try and, um, make it steer in a direction. And risk is risk. I mean, there's a risk there. It's always going to be there, no matter which way you slice it. It's going
Right.
to be there. So it's interesting that you said prior about that, and I think this show, we want to be different. We want to dissect different incidences that happen in the news, and some stuff that's not in the news, and kind of understand from a FISEC, physical security. And I will try and do definitions when I give acronyms, because you and I came from Amazon, where everything is an
Right.
acronym. So understanding from a FISEC standard a point of view, where we could have prevented it, or we could make sure it's less likely to happen again. We'll have some guests on this show here and there. We'll sprinkle in some guests, which would be pretty cool, right?
Yep.
And if you're interested in being a guest, reach out to us. You can reach out to us, and we'll kind of talk prior. But let me ask you a question, Jimmy. We're just going to go straight into it, which is there's an enormous amount of growth going on in the retail space, the wholesale space, in corporate America, office buildings and things like that. At what point should risk assessments be conducted during your planning stage of your expansion, or opening up a new location or a new warehouse? At what point do you feel that person should be brought in, that stakeholder should be brought in from risk?
From the as far up the rivers as we can, right? I'll tell you, I think in order, when we're looking at new spaces, we definitely need to make sure that we're not setting ourselves up for failure. Or if we are setting ourselves up for failure, that we are prepared for it. And let me explain that, right? So if I'm off, if I'm going to be opening up a new warehouse, um, and I'm going to be looking at an area, I want to know what the crime is in that area. And then if it's a high crime area, I want to make sure that I have the proper physical security measures in place. Um, when we're looking at office space, if I'm looking at office space, I want to take into account what's currently at the location to provide that risk assessment, right? And again, we will explain it. What I'm looking at, what are the vulnerabilities that are existing in that particular area. But to your specific question, we want to be involved as far upstream as possible. Now, I will tell you that real estate folks have a tendency of not wanting to bring in security early on, because they want to be able to, they have a look at a number of the other important factors, traffic concerns, cost of the land, flooding areas, et cetera, et cetera. And they don't want to have one more piece into it. But but the argument that I've made to real estate, and I continue to make to our real estate teams, is that security is just as important in the security environment, in the vulnerability environment, and the threat environment that we're putting these locations into, is just as important as everything else. The traffic reviews, the flood plains, the infrastructure support. Just like if I'm looking at a house, right? I'm looking at how the house is built, right? Does it have electricity? Does it have cable? Does it have Wi-Fi? And is it safe?
Yeah.
right? And so that should be just as big of a deal as everything else.
Do you think, I mean, do you think the culture within real estate is not bringing risk in because they're a barrier, or the no, like they're the no people, which is I don't want to involve them because I found a great cheap piece of property, and this is great for profit because we buy a piece of property really, really cheap. We can build it. And I don't want to get these guys in FISEC or risk involved because they're going to tell me no. And do you think that's the culture? And if it is the culture, is it wrong?
No, I don't think that's the culture, right? I think it's a fact that we security professionals don't sell ourselves and don't
Yeah.
explain it. And part of what we're trying to do here is better explain it. Um, I'll tell you, from the experience, the question you get is, what do you mean it's high risk, right? What do you mean it's a high crime? And if so, well, what do you want me to do about it?
Hmm.
Right. And this is where, as security professionals, and what we're, Nick, you and I are going to try to help out our listeners to do is to be able to explain this a little bit better, and to take this into account, because opening up a warehouse in a high risk area from a piece of ground that has nothing versus one that's surrounded by 12-foot walls in the exact same area, they're going to have different risk profiles.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what we have to make sure that we're explaining to real estate. I think the pushback from real estate is really, they just don't, okay, it's high risk. What does that mean? Whereas within the real estate infrastructure and the support, they know if, the local code enforcement needs additional traffic lights for an area, it's very easy for them to understand. If if it's in a floodplain, that's very easy for them to understand. We just have to do a better job of explaining to the real estate teams what it means to be in a high risk area, and what it would cost us in the long run.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think in the risk field, in the profession, we don't do a very good job of selling the pros of what's important. I'll add on to what you said too, which is getting risk in and FISEC in earlier rather than later also allows for proper budgeting, which is it's a lot easier to rope into your budget, 8-foot fences, control arms, additional cameras, and other things in a high crime area or a high risk location than it is to launch. And then it's close to 200% more because your contractors that are coming in and putting fences up and putting new cameras up and putting more lighting up, they need to work around what is already there. They need to
Right.
work around your business. They don't want to, affect your business. So what winds up happening is you pay a premium price because 9 times out of 10, those vendors are going to want to come after hours. With after hours comes with a premium price. And it's a lot difficult to run, coax cables and all these other things across a warehouse or across an office building where drop ceiling has already been put down, conveyor belts are already in the warehouse, all these factors that come in later on. And I didn't understand any of that
Right.
stuff. Like when I was in field LP, I would go, well, I want 10 more cameras in here. I want to be
Right.
able to cover this and I want to cover that. And I know I'm going on a tangent here, but from a field perspective, when I'm looking at where to put cameras and instead of getting risk involved and FISEC involved, I'm putting cameras based on impulse and not really expertise. It's emotion more than it's expertise. And so when you're doing all that stuff, the dollar signs are going further and further and further up because somebody from FISEC or somebody like yourself can come in and go, hey, there's a server right there. Like we can branch off of there instead of running 700 feet of cable around the whole place. So I think from a budget standpoint, even though you're saving money on building a site or buying property in a high crime or high risk location, that's not the problem. Like you can build businesses, you can do all of these things in high crime or high risk or very high risk locations but you have to make the preparations. You have to
Right.
do the proper things, right?
Right. No, spot on, right? And I think, on the physical security piece, and I think you and I are going to really come back to this integration with physical security quite a bit.
Yeah.
My quick, 10-second story on this of like where I came from to where I was, where I am now is after 9/11, I was at Barksdale Air Force Base, and I was the base's first anti-terrorism officer. And I remember very clearly, one of the first things that I was tasked to do was to go put cameras at our gates, which is unfathomable now that an Air Force base or any military installation doesn't have cameras at their gates. But we had the old, VHS, I think probably beta cameras at each of the gates. None of them was connected. But, my boss didn't know any better and I didn't know any better. And so literally what I did is I went out to Amazon and quoted, I don't know, probably $10,000 for cameras at
Yeah.
our miles apart, gates. When we finally had someone to come in, and that's what I got budgeted, was like $10,000. Oh, $10,000 for the cameras. Whenever the camera installer came and gave us a quote of, I don't know, $300,000, say, like my jaw dropped.
Yeah.
What do you mean? Well, the cameras are the least expensive part of this. Going back now to your exact point, right? Like the camera itself, the card reader itself, whatever mitigation that we're putting into place is usually the cheapest part of this solution. It's making sure that we're budgeting it properly up front. And you're spot on, right? Like the risk is never zero, but we can bring that risk down to a tolerable level.
Mhm.
And ultimately that's really what we're trying to do is we're here is explain that, and that's really where it comes down to the success of let me rewind. This comes back to why being able to talk risk is so important, because we want to be able to say to real estate, you're going to go put a warehouse, you're going to go make an office space in a high risk area, period. This is what it means. It means you're going to have more crime. You're going to have more property crime. More of our employees and our colleagues are going to get their cars broken into. We're probably going to have issues with the local community harassing our folks going in and out of the office, and we're going to be dealing with all this stuff, right? But if you put these measures in, here is where we went from a high risk down to a low risk.
Yeah.
Now, where being able to speak risk comes into play is being able to clearly articulate that and to say, well, this is why, because the threats haven't changed. Those, we're still going to be in a high risk area, or I should say high threat area for car break-ins and for harassment. But because I have a fence around the parking lot, I'm reducing the vulnerability of our associates. So yeah, I think I went on my own tangent, but I think
No, I think you're good.
Yeah, it came down to the fact that there is a huge advantage to identifying risk early so that we can most properly prepare for it.
Yeah, and I'll say it for the first time on the show, where we'll have a counter somewhere. We'll say it 50,000 times, which is mitigation measures.
Yeah.
Before I came to risk, of course I heard the word mitigation, but I really didn't understand what mitigating measures were, or mitigation library, or any of these terms, these risk terms, and they were just mind blowing to me. Where when I came over, we had a team, I was on your team, and we had a team where we would talk, and you were like, if you do these mitigating measures, you go from, you can take your high risk and lower it to moderate and even low if you do these measures. And it was selling, I wouldn't even say selling, it's explaining that to the field and to our stakeholders and our partners. Mitigating measures work if you do them properly.
Right.
And the equipment that you put in is only as good as the people that, one, monitor it, and two, ensure that it's put in correctly, and it's done within budget. Like, that's the other thing, is you can spend millions of dollars, but it doesn't mean it's the best thing out there.
No, but you caught yourself, but I don't think you should have. It is selling it, right?
Yeah.
Security, at the end of the day, as we become more and more mature within the business space, I keep hearing, hey, ROI. What's the ROI? What's the ROI? Well, what's the return on investment from the security? Um, and there's a belief out there that it has to be some real dollars. And I think there are opportunities that we'll talk about, guards versus analytical cameras, that can provide some real dollar savings.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the ROI here is that we're spending money to go provide, life safety and increase the life safety. And it's our job within the security space, and specifically the risk space, and why we're doing this, to be able to better articulate, you know, what that ROI is for implementing those mitigation measures.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think, we talked. I know I'm not sure if you want to talk now about like the various, threat versus risk versus mitigation.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Do you want
I
me to get
will.
into that?
Yeah, and I will say, it's great that you brought up ROI because that is a very hot topic. Like it's a very, very hot topic within the industry, which is what's my ROI on this camera system? What's my ROI on getting a new security company to come in? What's my ROI? And things to consider is your reputational risk. Like,
Right.
how do you quantify your reputation? Like, you build a site, it's in a high risk location, you don't do any of these risk mitigating measures, and something, God forbid, happens, your reputation takes a huge hit because you have already had these things identified, but you didn't put any mitigating measures in place to reduce that risk. So
Right.
I think ROI it's tricky. I think it's tricky in some cases. We've seen it in the risk field, which is get me a ROI on this risk assessment that you did where we executed it. What's the ROI on it? It's
Yeah.
difficult. It's difficult to quantify what that ROI is because in some cases you don't see the dollar savings. It's the things that you avoided that you can't put a dollar on. So tangent
Yeah.
also, but yeah.
No, I think the whole ROI thing. I don't. I know we've already have a plan for the other episodes we're doing, but I really think like we need to devote an entire episode to ROI,
Absolutely.
because
Absolutely.
you're absolutely right. Like the easy answer is I'm able to go put this piece of technology in to go replace this or to stop this. I'm going to put an analytical camera in so I can remove a guard. I'm going to go put cameras in this particular spot because this is where things are getting stolen. But but the not the irony, the sad part is that's not the majority of what we deal with.
Yeah.
The majority of deal with is those threats, those evolving threats, the unrealized threats, that if we don't do something, we're going to be suffering from it. So
I agree. I
yeah.
agree. So going into what you were saying, mitigation and things like that, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think when we're talking risk, right? To your point, we're going to say mitigation a lot. I've said risk, I've said threat a bunch of times. Um, I and I even catch myself talking threat versus risk. I think the first lesson that we should provide here is really learning to and really sticking to talking security risk and understanding the terms, because every one of these terms really has a different meaning to it.
Hmm.
And where we sometimes can confuse the threat versus risk, our business owners will do the same thing. And it's not necessarily that we need to teach them how to do it, but we need to make sure that amongst us that we understand it. And I'm going to use, Nick knows this, and some other folks I've worked with in the past. I'm going to use a very basic kind of analogy of, I live in Florida. Nick lives in Florida. Florida is the shark capital of the world,
Yeah.
right? And so I'm going to use that kind of analogy and kind of talk through that to talk about a number of things. I'm going to talk information, intelligence, threat, mitigation. I'm sorry, threat, vulnerability, risk, and then mitigation, right? So the first thing I just said, Florida is the shark capital of the world. That is information, right? That is just it's common knowledge. It is not nothing that I'm supposed to really be concerned with. If I'm going to the Gulf Coast and I'm looking at, okay, well, I'm going to be going swimming in the Gulf Coast. I know that there are sharks within the Gulf Coast region, right? And I'm going to know that is intelligence for me as I go to the Gulf Coast, that I could in fact encounter a shark if I go swimming in one of these in the Gulf waters. But is it a threat to me? Well, if I go to Anna Maria Island, for example, and I don't go swimming, it's not a threat to me. I'm not going to get into the water. But if I'm going to get into the water, now I know that sharks are around. The intelligence says that there are sharks within this water, and now I'm going to be I'm going to be going swimming at Anna Maria Island. There is a threat to myself of getting bit by a shark. What's the threat? That goes back to that intelligence. Kind of back it up. The intelligence and the threats kind of play off each other. Because if I were going to, New Smyrna Beach in Florida, which is the shark capital of the United States, my threat is going to be greater than if I were to go to, someplace else. Going into it, that's the intelligence that I'm having into it. So working into it now that I know that there is a threat to myself getting, attacked by a shark. Now you can increase or decrease that threat. Am I going to swim with a bloody foot or shiny object or any of the number of things? We're not shark experts, right? I think Shark Week was last week. Um, you know, whatever attracts a shark, right? Am I going to the water with that? That's increasing my threat. But just like increasing the threat, I can also decrease the threat, right? I'm going to go swimming with other people. I'm going to go
Shallow area.
the shallow area. I'm going to go jump in a kayak instead of swim itself. So now the threat, yes, there's a threat of shark attack, but now I am applying, my vulnerability of me swimming in the water is now being reduced because we're employing mitigation measures. So then it comes down to what that final risk is, right? And using this, we look at the term is inherent versus residual risk. The inherent risk of me going swimming into the Gulf of Mexico is high and getting bit by a shark. The inherent risk of getting bit by a shark swimming in the Gulf of Mexico is high. Because I'm going in the shallow end, I'm actually going to be in a kayak, and there's lots of people around me. I've now applied mitigation measures to bring that risk down to a tolerable level. So now I'm going to be going into the water. And so all of that to say, and I'm sure people are listening to this and going, oh, hold on a sec, rewind. What is he talking about? Risk on it. It really comes down to the threat. What's the threat? The threat is the verb. The threat is the action. What am I at what is a high threat to me? And then the vulnerability, what am I doing about it?
Yeah.
And then based off of that, then you determine what the risk is, right? And that's really why you'll catch myself. And it's still easy to say, hey, what's my risk of shark attack? Well, because you're talking about the risk, or are you talking about a threat? But at the end of the day, those are the big terms. Threat, vulnerability, risk are very distinct piece of it to bring it all into play.
Yeah, I've heard you explain that probably 40 times because I learned from you how to do site visits and risk assessments. So I'm always mentally memorizing those things. You switch it up every once in a while, but what I've learned from
I
that
add
is
to it. Like any good artist, I'm gonna make it interesting every single time.
Yeah, yeah. Like any good comedian, you switch it from special to special, But I learned, you know, don't go swimming in Anna Maria Island. That's
Yep.
the that's the whole thing. But
Right.
it's interesting because I've gotten into a couple of debates. I don't even say debates, just conversations with people that don't, that ask that question. What's the difference between a threat, um, and a vulnerability and all these other different things, and I tell that story and it's very plain. It's very easy to follow along because there are folks that think all of those things mean the same thing, and they
Right.
really don't. And you have to have an appreciation for the art of risk
Yeah.
assessments, and mitigating measures, and risk, doing all these different things. Like there's a lot of different nuances to it, which always intrigued me about it, and it's always evolving. But I think the big thing is selling it to folks that don't understand it. And the big thing that I discovered when I got into risk is I was the person on the other end, and you were the person from risk that was trying to explain to me how risk assessments can help my business. And I
Yep.
would only call you for risk assessments if I was having a really big visit. Like I'd be like, hey, I need this data because I know they're going to ask me about it, instead of really understanding what the data was and how to utilize it, which is if I had known back then in 50 of those sites that I had that were high risk, that I can not get, but utilize or use, better camera systems, or camera carts, or whatever they're calling them today, and all these other things to reduce my risks from high down to at least moderate. It'd be in a lot better of a situation. I would have had a lot less security incidences. I would have had a lot less visits from law enforcement and things like that. So long-winded, but that really was a good explanation. Really good, Jimmy.
Yeah. And I think, taken into a real life example, right, and to what you're talking about. I remember early on when we were starting to develop the risk process. We'd get our customers asking for a one pager or a single sheet risk assessment, and we would get into discussions with them of our risk scoring, because we were looking, again, what's the threat of the area? Well, a threat, there might be car break-ins in the general area, but in order to develop that risk, that threat, we would look at the incident rates, right? And so we'd say, okay, it's a very high risk, it's a very high threat for car break-ins in this particular area, but at your particular site, we're not seeing any. And so the threat of a car break-in is moderate, low, because maybe it is a very high threat for car break-ins, but we're not seeing it. And then we would use that to say, well, because it's a low to moderate threat, well, your risk is low to moderate, because that's really
Yeah.
where it starts. And then what we'd find when you discover it, and that's what we'd give them. Hey, you're a low or moderate threat. You're a low or moderate risk. And they'd push back to go, hold on a sec. We're employing, and they would give us a laundry list of mitigation measures that they've applied to it. And, things that from our angle of monitoring thousands of sites, stuff that we couldn't necessarily know about because of they implemented at their particular location in St. Louis or DC or whatever. And that's where you're like, oh, time out. Okay, so this is a whole different story, right? It is a very high risk, very high threat area for car break-ins. You've taken that information and intelligence and applied the correct mitigation measures, and now what we have is a low risk area, a low residual risk area. And so what I'd come back to him and said, right now you're doing what you need to do, and you're buying it down to that low risk. it is a high threat area, but you've now bought this down to the low risk. And why these discussion would often come up is going back to early discussion is what the ROI is. Well, I want to go take out these, the $2 million a year I'm spending on guards and go put $1 million fence in. Okay. Well, now we can go look at that and say we want to put a comparable mitigation measure in place so that we can continue to buy down that risk to an acceptable level. So, understanding, that, and this comes back to the whole point of this isn't a two-dimensional risk isn't a two-dimensional problem. It's a three-dimensional problem that we need to be going after.
Yeah, and I'll flip it around the other way too, Jimmy, which is we got a lot of, car break-ins are out of control. Like I'm in a high crime area. Car break-ins are out of control. Crime is through the roof. All this other stuff. And risk assessments and mitigating measures are only as good as the data that's available for us to analyze. And the big thing is, if you're not capturing that data, if you're not capturing those car break-ins, if you're not capturing those assaults on your folks that are going in and out of those office buildings and all these other different things, it never happened. And we had a saying in law enforcement, which is no report, no crime. No report, no crime. No victim, no crime. And I mean, people that are listening to this that are now in the corporate field that were law enforcement are probably chuckling because it was great for us because no crime meant that we had a reduction in crime. But on the back end of it, it really screws you in the end because you want to get that $1 million fence, right? You want to get some camera carts and stuff like that. So when we pull up your data on the computer and we're like, you've had 2 car break-ins in the last 5 years. And they're like, no, I had 12 last week. And you and I, we usually would sit in the car with each other on the drive back from visiting sites and chuckle because we would go, how do I know that? I don't know that because you're not entering it into whatever system system you use, whoever's listening. We don't have access to it because you didn't enter it. Or the other issue is taking all of these offenses or taking all of these incidents that happen and putting it under one report. This was what we called in law enforcement triple stacking, which is you take all of these offenses and put it into one report because that means you only had one assault or one car that was stolen. But if you double click that report, there's 15 cars that were stolen during that time period. So I think what really with this episode also is the mitigation measures are only as good as the data that we have available to us to assess. And it's frustrating sometimes because when you are trying to help folks, you're like, when I'm looking at, you're low risk. And they're like, I know I'm high risk. I know I live in a high crime. I work in a high crime area. That was the other one that I used to always enjoy, which was, I'm in a high crime area. And then you run their crime data and they're like 2 times below the national average in crime. And they're like, well, we got panhandlers on every corner.
Yep.
That's not high crime.
And I think this is where I think that no report, no crime thing is huge, right? And it's not we talk about our time, at the previous company, but I'll tell you, I'm dealing with the exact same thing now, right? Mm-hmm. And it's getting your customers to understand the importance of that.
Data capture.
If there are any security managers or people, future security managers, security, risk managers watching this, like this is my first thing I did I should say my first thing I did at Amazon. One of the things I quickly learned I needed to do at Amazon was really to take that information and go and pull it into one location. Because early on, like when I first joined the company, there was a lot of, hey, I need you to risk justify this, putting fences in, more guards, more cameras, right? And all I wanted to do was to go help them out. Mm-hmm. Well, then what I was finding was someone came to me yelling, screaming, crying, bent, on their knees, saying, "Hey, I need a defense for my 10 car break-ins last month." And then I'd have the same discussion with someone that had 2 car break-ins, and I was like, "Hold on, what is the norm, right?" And that's really what you need to establish, and that's really what I'm getting to, is that, whether you have 1 site, 10 sites, or 1,000 sites, you have to identify what the threat norms are for those locations, because
Yeah.
that is the only way you can understand if it's, within the norm, or is it outside the norm, right? I think I mean, it's a huge piece of this when we talk to the actual operation, of risk, is being able to identify what's inside, what is normal, what's not inside normal. If I have a whatever in downtown New York City, I'm going to have a certain amount of crime. That's going to happen,
Yeah.
no matter what, right? What is the norm? What's not? And then when it comes, then being able to a situation where you're not waiting on the customer, and you're be able to proactively identify, hey, you've reached a certain threshold of incidents, and we need to help you out. So yeah, I think that's a huge point. And like, as we continue to develop, that's one thing that we need to stress, is that we need these, you need to be partnering with the customers. And I think part of this is making sure that they understand the why, right? And that was a big piece that we talked about, Nick. We used to talk about, Nick, is that if there's no incentive for them to report it, they're not going to report it.
Yep.
The adage we used to use in the military is, what gets checked gets done.
Hmm.
If they're reporting 15 car break-ins and no one cares, and no one's reporting it back, and there's nothing that happens to it, they're going to stop reporting it.
Yep.
But if your customers as a whole know that the only way you're going to get them additional support is making sure that they identify these issues, then they have some incentive to report it.
Yeah. That was the big thing when I came on to risk, was explaining the why, because it was,
Yeah.
you know, I remember having big meetings with big stakeholders right from the beginning, which was, the reason why we need you to do these reports, or the reason why we need to capture this stuff, is because of X, Y, and Z. And we got in front of it instead of waiting for something to happen and then realize that they weren't capturing the data. We gave the heads up way before. Now you get the one-offs that still don't report it,
Right.
and you're like, I told you, like, I can't help you, get a $300,000 security system with 2 incidences in the last 3 years. It's
Right.
not going to happen. So, um, all in all, I think really, really great first episode.
Yeah.
This originally was going to be intros. What are we doing? And then, then it grew. We have several different episodes planned. The next episode 2, is going to be threats are evolving. Are you? So we're going to talk a little bit about threats and evolving threats, especially in today's current climate. Different things that are going on, and are you evolving in your business? So, but Jimmy, I leave it up to you to close us out, man.
No, Nick, again, I really applaud you for putting this together. This was your idea from the start, and I applaud you for pushing forward and really you know, getting me involved with it. I'm super excited. I
Me too.
think this discussion, exactly what you said. We were kind of initial, hey, this is who we are, this is what we're planning on doing. But I think this comes back to, why we're doing this. We both we're very, very passionate about risk. And, we start getting into it, and we start turning into, teacher mode. What I think, as we evolve, there's a lot of things that we can, break down and individually talk. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do and what we're hoping out of this is that people are going to learn some stuff, right? We have a lot of experience, full stop. of dealing with law enforcement security pieces to it. I think what's going to be interesting too, we're talking about threats. I think, as we get through and maybe exhaust some of the security stuff, bring in some other risk people, right? Compliance risk. I know some folks, out of USAA and a few other companies that deal with compliance risk. I'd love to see that. I'd love to, get some of these other industry risk folks in and compare and contrast, because I think what we'll find is a lot of the basics are the same. We just, as opposed to talking about car break-ins, they're going to talk about, regulatory risks and things along those lines.
Yeah.
And then I think, you and I chatted about it too. I think, we have a lot of experience dealing with gun violence. And I know we'll talk threats, next week, but I think at some point we really need to spend an entire episode talking about gun violence. We've done a
100%.
lot of research of looking at how to identify where and what locations are at high risk for firearms, and what can we do about it,
Yeah.
right?
And there's some great solutions out there too, like really good solutions.
Yep. But no, overall, man, like, hey, this is, super happy to be part of this. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for coming up with it. And I applaud you for pushing forward, and looking forward to future episodes.
Thanks, buddy. Thanks. All right, folks. I would encourage you, the little banner that's down here on YouTube. Follow us at Risky Business Dash Podcast Show. Like and subscribe and share. We will post these on LinkedIn and other social media outlets. So please like and share, and we appreciate you tuning in. And we will see you on the next one.